Soviet gulag for a number of years. And I remember Natan saying to me a story that he's told many people, which is that when he was in the gulag, he and his fellow prisoners passed messages to each other about Ronald Reagan and about the message of Ronald Reagan and Ronald Reagan telling them that the United States stood with them, that we stood with those prisoners, that we stood for people who were prisoners of conscience, who were fighting for their freedom, and how much it meant to them. A few years ago, I met a young man, he's my age, so I think he's a young man. I met a man who escaped from Cuba when he was 14. And he got on a boat by himself, came to the United States. And I asked him, I said, how did you know? You're 14 years old, this was before the internet. I said, how did you know that you should risk everything to come to America? What gave you that confidence? And without missing a beat, he said, the speeches of Ronald Reagan. And I asked him how he had heard the speeches of Ronald Reagan. And he said that he and his family had a radio. And at night, they would listen to the radio with a blanket over their heads so the neighbors couldn't hear. But they were able to get Radio Marti, and they heard Ronald Reagan speaking of freedom. I had an amazing experience here at the Reagan Library a few years ago. I was meeting with the defense minister from one of the Baltic countries. And we were talking, and I told him that story. And he looked at me and he said, I had the same thing happen to me. That's my life. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, when I was a young boy growing up behind the Iron Curtain, we could watch Finnish television at night, and we could hear Ronald Reagan. And he said his parents told him that Ronald Reagan was a great man and America is a great country. I had the chance to see the power of faith and freedom. When I was in Kenya in the mid-'80s, Pope John Paul II visited. And I went and listened to him talk about his faith and learned later, obviously, when I was working in Poland about the differences that he'd made there. But one of the most moving experiences that I've had was visiting with Pope John Paul II and my father in about 2004. And he grabbed my dad's hand and he looked into his eyes and he said, God bless the United States of America. And I know that God has blessed us. God has blessed America. But our freedom will only survive if we protect it, if we take our duty and our obligation seriously. Today, we're facing threats to our freedom abroad, around the world, and here at home. And the list of these threats is not insubstantial. From Russia to China to Iran to North Korea, American adversaries are certainly on the march. We had some good news within just the last 48 hours or so that Sweden and Finland will become members of NATO. And I think it's an important lesson to Vladimir Putin, that is the opposite of what he had expected. If he had hoped that his invasion would lead to weakening NATO, he's managed to expand NATO. And I think that's an important message. Here at home, we have significant challenges as well. The Biden administration economic policies have contributed to the worst inflation in 40 years. every one of us bears to perpetuate the Republic. We must not do that, and we cannot do that. Ronald Reagan said it is up to us in our time to choose, and to choose wisely, between the hard but necessary task of preserving peace and freedom and the temptation to ignore our duty and blindly hope for the best while the enemies of freedom grow stronger day by day. No party and no people and no nation can defend and perpetuate a constitutional republic if they accept a leader who's gone to war with the rule of law, with the democratic process, or with the peaceful transition of power, with the Constitution itself. As the full picture is coming into view with the January 6th committee, it has become clear that the efforts Donald Trump oversaw and engaged in were even more chilling and more threatening than we could have imagined. As we have shown, Donald Trump attempted to overturn the presidential election. He attempted to stay in office and to prevent the peaceful transfer of presidential power. He summoned a mob to Washington. He knew they were armed on January 6th. He knew they were angry. And he directed the violent mob to march on the Capitol in order to delay or prevent completely the counting of electoral votes. He attempted to go there with them. And when the violence was underway, he refused to take action to tell the rioters to leave. Instead, he incited further violence by tweeting that the Vice President, Mike Pence, was a coward. He said, quote, "Mike deserves it." And he didn't want to do anything in response to the Hang Mike Pence chants. It's undeniable. It's also painful for Republicans to accept. And I think we all have to recognize and understand what it means to say those words and what it means that those things happened. But the reality that we face today as Republicans, as we think about the choice in front of us, we have to choose, because Republicans cannot both be loyal to Donald Trump and loyal to the Constitution. At this moment, and as we think about this choice, and as I think about how I come to this choice, the first thing that I think about is that I come to this choice as a mother, committed to ensuring that my children and their children can continue to live in an America where the peaceful transfer of power is guaranteed. We must ensure that we live in a nation that is governed by law and not by men. And I come to this choice as an American, as a citizen of the greatest nation God has ever created on the face of this earth. And I come to this choice as a person of faith, as someone who believes deeply that our rights come from God, not from the government, and always mindful that we must pray as though everything depends upon God, because it does, and we must work as though everything depends upon us, because it does. America is exceptional. We're the exceptional nation. We're a good and a great nation. And our history teaches us that ordinary Americans in every generation have done extraordinary things. They have done heroic things. Our men and women in uniform have made the ultimate sacrifice to defend our freedom. And that task is now ours. In his inaugural address, President Kennedy said this. He said, "In the long history of the world, there have only been a few generations that have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. And today, that responsibility is ours." And what a magnificent responsibility that is, and what a blessing it is that that is our duty and our obligation. But my fellow Americans, we stand at the edge of an abyss, and we must pull back. We must pull back. One of my Democratic colleagues said to me recently that he looked forward to the day when he and I could disagree again. And believe me, I share that sentiment. Because when we can disagree again about substance and policy, that will mean that our politics have righted themselves. That will mean that we have made the decision that we are going to reject anti-democratic forces, that we are going to reject toxicity, that we are going to reject some of the worst kinds of racism and bigotry and anti-Semitism that characterize far too much of our politics today. History has taught us that what begins as words ends as far worse, and we must reject those things. So while I know that we will come to a day when we can begin again to disagree on substance and policy, I think it's important for us to take this moment